You've all settled down? Okay, this is the last time you're going to hear from me today. Managed to palm on one of the presentations off. What I'm going to talk about here are the Department of Conservation Services Program contracts. What this program is, and it's essentially funded through fisheries levies. The fishing industry is levied a certain amount of money to support research into issues like bycatch and so on. So direct commercial fishing impacts, include species being caught, killed or injured in nets or on lines, and also birds coming onto vessels as well. And impacts may be indirect as well through modification of food availability, and that's something that the Trust has been contracted to do, and I'll talk about in a minute. The projects we have been working on over the years, our first contract was with CSP was 2016, 2017. It was around diving and foraging behaviour of petrels around shearwaters around fishing vessels, and this required a trial in the first year. In the second year was running a series of experiments, again led by Megan Friesian, University of Auckland. And what we were looking at, we built special camera rigs that we attached to the back of a boat, James's boat mostly, and birds were filmed diving and looking at their behaviour in relation to what baits were being used, whether it was squid, whether it was fish, and so on. So that was the first contract that we had with the department. And one of the things that we got from it, and it was something I encouraged Doc to actually put some extra money into, was we knew we were going to get some interesting images that we could utilise, to promote what seabirds were about, to advocate on seabirds' behaviour. And so we employed or contracted Richie Robinson, an underwater photographer, to take images. He in fact won a Canon Award for that particular image that year, 2016. But this is the sort of thing that we were filming around the boats. Oops. Quite sure why that's not playing. Just hope my computer's not doing a hissy fit. One of the things we found, this video clip, when it runs, actually shows fluttering shearwaters baits were being dropped over at a regular sort of rate, and the shearwaters were coming in. And what we found, there was a difference between species and how they behaved around the boats. We found black petrels could dive quite readily, would chase baits, were reasonably inquisitive about what they were after. Flesh-footed shearwaters went straight in, grabbed whatever was down there, and you could see why they were getting caught on hooks. There was no discrimination between just a bait floating around. Whereas fluttering shearwaters were really intriguing. What we found was that they could dive around, swim around. They were nosing up to bits of bait, looking at it, very inquisitive, very selective about what they were after.
Sorry, everyone.
Just going to try and sort out.
Chris's computer's freaking out.
It's the problem of taking a computer onto an island or islands and filling it with dust, salt, all sorts of things.
just going to have to leave that at some
All right, we'll skip that one, otherwise it might do the same again. The project that we've been working on pretty much since 2017, it started off with what is essentially a literature review, but also an assessment of at-sea sightings, sort of looking at behaviours of seabirds as observed at sea over a number of years. And it was based around data that I'd been collecting since about 2003. But what we were looking at was the relationship between, say, petrels and shearwaters, and their foraging, and in primes and storm petrels and so on, and their foraging around shoaling fish or fish schools or fish workups. And you know, a lot of you would be familiar with the purseine fishery. There was a concern that basically as these schools were being sort of hauled up, the food resource made available by those fish schools to seabirds was disappearing. And this initiated the study by the CSP, by the Conservation Services Program, to look at the indirect effects on seabirds from the purseine fishery. And this was the first year that we got into it. But there are other CSP contracts going. I think Black Petrel is partly funded mainly through MPI, but flesh-footed shearwater work is certainly through the Conservation Services. Aerial surveys that Peter Frost is going to be talking about later on, and gannets and so on, white-fronted terns, was partly funded by that, and also partly funded by Birds New Zealand. National Survey on pied shags, again funded through the CSP program. And there have been over the years trials of various seabird mitigation measures, basically looking at fishers had developed line setters devices which, you know, took the lines down below the surface and then released the baits below the depth that the birds could forage at or dive to, things like that. Also trialling using different deterrent measures around boats, you know, using, say, oil on the water and see whether that would, like fish oil around the boats, whether that would deter the birds coming in. But we have been looking at this question, seabirds' reliance on these fish schools. The theory is that basically the fish, the trevally, the kawai and so on, are feeding on krill. These dense workups make that krill available to the birds at the surface, and hence you get this sort of feeding frenzy that you see in this image here. So a little bit of drone footage. So tightly packed, highly mobile schools of trevally and kawai have been the focus of concerns voiced by several commentators, you know, about the apparent decline of numbers and the sizes of the schools and the potential impact from purseine fishery, as I was saying, but not only on seabirds but also on the whole ecosystem. Our project has become as much a study of the fish school dynamics as it was on what the seabirds are actually feeding on. The species that we were looking at over the last 3 years now, Rako bullish shearwaters, Titi wainui, fairy prime, Pakaha fluttering shearwaters, Takupo, the gannets, Tara the white-fronted tern, and the red-billed gulls. But our observations also included the other two species down below, flesh-footed shearwaters and white-faced storm petrels. While all 6 species in this study were observed feeding away from fish school activity, and on occasion on very large numbers spread across large areas, the draw card of fish school activity, and for some birds marine mammal activity, signals fast food availability for large numbers of these birds. They use sight, smell and potentially sound to home in on these concentrations. And this photograph is taken by Pete Mitchell off Ocean Beach, you know, quite close to shore. That's bullish shearwaters feeding en masse. The fish species that have been targeted by the purseine fishery are also the same species that occur in the fish schools that we've been studying: kahawai trevally, jack mackerel, blue mackerel, saury, skipjack tuna, pilchards and anchovies. Now, coincidentally, when I was putting together this presentation yesterday, I received a set of images from Shannon Weaver. She works for the Conservation Services program and is probably our main contact. Now, her partner's father used to be a spotter plane pilot and would make these observations. So he took this photograph in the Bay of Plenty, she said way back when, a long time ago. But basically you can see how a purseine boat operates. You've got a work up in the centre. The boat runs a net out towed by a small boat, which drops off the back of the main boat, runs a ring round it, and then they just slowly pull it together like a purse and pull it all up. But they work initially with a spotter plane doing these cruises, searching for these fish schools and locating them, and of course then the boats go out and mow them up. So if we come to terms with the potential impacts from fishing on seabirds, not just the purseine fishery and the marine ecosystems that support them, we need to get to grips with the trophic interactions at play. So overseas, a lot of work has been done on this. Studied for over 100 years. Food web links, well described. Seabirds diets, pretty well known. Connections to fisheries known. In New Zealand, no, not so good. Incidental research over the last maybe up to 50 years. Food web links, very poorly known. Seabird diets, well, we're just starting to pick up on that. Connection to fisheries, well, that's the big question that we're sort of looking at, particularly these indirect impacts. And there's some immediate conservation concerns that need to be investigated for some seabirds. So there's an urgent need to start tracing back food webs starting from seabirds. Right. Part of this work has involved sampling around fish schools, so towing a plankton net like the one you just saw, as close to the fish school as you can. These fish schools can actually move very fast, and it becomes a little bit hit and miss, but when you get it right, you get it really right. But what we're sampling is looking at what the fish are feeding on, and that's giving us an indication of what prey might be available to the seabirds. The seabirds, in most cases, are not feeding on the fish in these schools. They're feeding on what the fish are feeding on. The exceptions come with say, gannets and maybe flesh-footed shearwaters, which start feeding on some of the fish, but generally those are the ones that are being pursued by dolphins as well. So here in the photograph you can see this is a mixed trevally and kahawai school. You can see the krill. What we're finding is that as the school gets more dense and get closer, you get this sort of much more dense sort of accumulation of krill, to this extent where some of the videos just blanketed out by how dense the krill is, and then the fish school moves on. And the birds tend to follow these fish schools very sort of very closely behind, feeding on the krill. These couple of photographs taken in the field. The one on the left shows there's a lot of salps out in the Gulf at the moment, and throughout a lot of the season. But this was a haul that we were doing a sort of mix of 30-metre drops, vertical drops, but also plankton tows, or tows around the workup. And this one's done where we saw an algal slick line on the surface, and we did a drop underneath it and pulled up salps, but also juvenile mackerel there as well. The one on the right is just jam-packed full of krill, and that's from a tow basically across the face of one of these fish schools. you get this sort of response. So you sort of, you get it from the net, from the cod end of the net, you pour it into a jug, and then you sample from that, put the sample into ethanol, and then it gets processed and everything gets identified. I did actually I did a trial fish patty, or a krill patty, but it didn't work. But what our study has revealed is that there is considerable variety in the feeding associations for seabirds, not only in relation to the different types of fish school and activity, but also marine mammals and their feeding on fish and squid. So at the top you get, some of the birds that are feeding on the zooplankton, and then you sort of, as you come down around it, you get these birds that are pursuing small fish. Some birds are able to dive deep, some birds are feeding on quite large fish like the gannets, and then you're getting down to the bottom where birds are feeding on discards, such as black petrels, flesh-footed shearwaters, and the discards are either coming largely from cetacean activity, cetaceans feeding and being messy feeders. Our study has identified 3 species that feed in very close association to these trevally and kahawai schools. So fluttering shearwaters, fairy prawns, red bull gulls, are essentially feeding on exactly what these fish, particularly the trevally and kahawai schools, are feeding on the krill. So the krill we're getting from the plankton toes is almost identical to the regurgitations we're getting from the birds. So these are regurgitations. This one's from fluttering shearwater, this one's from fairy prawns. You can see a mix of adult euphorsids and juvenile euphorsids. Red bull gulls are a little bit more difficult because we weren't able to sample them directly, get regurgitation. So we're having to rely mostly on fecal samples and some pellets that we were getting within the colony. So and there we were getting mixed signals, a lot of terrestrial stuff mixed in with marine stuff. But we do see them feeding in large numbers around these trevally schools. However, all the species demonstrate a range of foraging and feeding strategies, as I said. For example, gannets with their spectacular dive bombing, generally in association with pods of dolphins, like on the photograph on the left there, will also feed on their own. So you can be up on Parkery Beach and see a bird cruising along, occasionally diving, just beyond the waves. Terns can also be feeding with a variety of fish school types, some not readily visible, the fish not readily visible at the surface. However, they generally feed in flocks. With both these species, we know that they turn up with squid. And what was not known about white-fronted terns is that they feed on, there's a bird with a juvenile squid in its bill. That was a new record, that was out of Tawhanui. Gannets, interesting enough, and Nigel will be talking about this shortly, have quite a large proportion of squid in their diet, and sort of begs the question, well, how are they getting that? Because squid always thought to be further down the water column. Bullous shearwater, something of an enigma. I've sort of touched on this before. This shift from trevally feeding association with trevally kahawai and mackerel schools to this following skipjack tuna when the skipjack tuna comes into our waters. We haven't really got to the bottom of what's going on with this species. We have our tracking program underway, as I showed you before, and the work we're doing, looking at where they're foraging and the diet work, hopefully will reveal a lot more about that species. One of the things that we developed as part of this whole program has been sort of the use of these camera rigs. In this case, this is a floating camera rig. It's basically a whole bunch of GoPros on a disc down at the bottom of the shaft, and the whole thing has a buoy at the top of it, and you turn everything on and throw it into the water and hope you get some great footage, which you do from time to time when you get it right. Sometimes the fish decide to go elsewhere and all you get is just blue. but hopefully this works. No. It must be taking a while to load. Well, it's not going to play, but basically what's happened here is the fish have moved through, and what you're getting at the top are shearwaters diving down and feeding on the krill. And as I was saying before, earlier study had indicated that fluttering shearwaters are quite selective about what they're feeding on. In fact, what we're finding is that these birds, even with krill, will go down, and you can see them picking the krill up underwater and then going back up to the surface. And they'll do it en masse, and it's quite spectacular when you get a chance to see it. But it's coming through this sort of underwater photography, or videography that we're doing. And it's just a groovy image of a plankton toe, which isn't going to work either. So this leads into the next presentation, which is about the results of the zooplankton sampling. It was going to be presented by Lily Cosmian-Ledwood, but unfortunately she's very ill and obviously can't make it. So I've asked our reliable Kerry Lukes to step in. The reason why is, she does have a background on this. Kerry's been involved in the sampling we've been doing over the last couple of years, and is now part of the contract team to do the work over this coming season. So I'm going to hand over to Kerry. Thank you.